The experience of the bikes. My my first time there, I almost got ran over by a bike.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Azure Talks. Thank you for joining us today. And today I'm in the podcast with Steve Buchanan, Principal Program Manager at Microsoft, former 10-time Microsoft MVP, a Pluralsight author, and author of 8 technical books. What a career already, Steve. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me on the podcast. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for asking. And an absolute pleasure to have you here in Azure Talks. So we're like just in the new year, and I would firstly would wish you a very great and successful 2023.
Same to
And
you.
hope we thank you and hope we will do great things with each other because we're partners, right? I'm a Microsoft MVP. You are a 10-time former Microsoft MVP and now working at Microsoft. Do you have anything to add about this introduction? Actually, what you do on a day-to-day basis or whatsoever?
Yeah. At Microsoft, in my role currently, I'm focused on improving Azure Cloud, and I'm a multi-cloud expert. And of course, right, if anyone that's listening follows me, you know that I do a ton of stuff in Kubernetes, and so I'm very focused on AKS, right, as well as like Azure Arc. So yeah,
Awesome.
really doing some good stuff at Microsoft, and excited about the direction of Azure and things that we're doing. So.
Yeah, so I think that you already mentioned 2 topics that I really would like to elaborate on with you in this episode because, well, let's begin at containerization and Kubernetes, like you said. So it's a topic on your daily life, and containerization is something that is interest of many organizations. Demand is increasing and growing for to do stuff with hosting applications in containers. Yet my personal experience is that many organizations struggle to containerize their application landscape, right? So throwing it out there, where should organizations start in their journey to containers or containerization?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and you're right. That's exactly what I saw when I was still with Accenture and Avanade, is that organizations were very interested in containerizing their applications, and they were interested in adopting AKS, but they didn't really know where to start. And so, I did a lot of work in Azure in general, and we would start with the cloud foundations, and really that's cloud adoption framework, that's CAF, and you mentioned that you work with that as well. So CAF is a great set of artifacts and something that organizations can follow to get started with Azure, right? And so with AKS, there's something called the AKS baseline security, or security baseline. And it's a set of artifacts and guidance that's published by us, Microsoft, that organizations can use to get started with their AKS. And that's a place where organizations will want to get started, kind of working with AKS and containerization as well. And there's something that's a part of that called there's actually something called the AKS accelerator as well. And there's a landing zone for AKS. And so all of this is kind of bundled under learn.microsoft.com. You can do a quick search and find this, but you can use those artifacts to help guide you get started, to get started with AKS, as well as like with the AKS accelerator, it actually gives you code, right? And so you can actually use it if you're working with Terraform, if you're working with Bicep, or maybe you're using something else. You can go in and use that, and there's examples to help you get started. And so I'd recommend organizations start there if they want to get started with AKS. Now, for containerizing your applications, that's a little bit of a different story, right? You might have a monolith. You might have some microservices based applications. Maybe you're running those on premises. Maybe you're running those in other clouds. And so, maybe you're already running something that's containerized, but you want to move it to AKS, right? That's been more of a challenge for organizations trying to figure that out. And so if you have an application that isn't containerized, the first step is you really um, need to understand your application, and then you need to start to containerize it, right? And really, you want to be going down the route of stateless. Um, but if you do have stateful applications you need to run on AKS, you can do that as well. It's fully supported. There's storage options. There's guidance out there for that as well. But you'll start to containerize your components, and you'll really need to understand, the different components within AKS and what you're going to leverage. And so we had talked about this before we started on the podcast, right? About how security and networking is a critical component.
Absolutely.
Well, of cloud. Well, with Kubernetes, that's a critical component too. And really, you want to start there. So if you have an application and maybe it's monolith and you're going to break it apart, you need to understand how the different components are going to talk to each other. So now we're talking about networking, right? You need to understand how your users are going to access that. So it goes beyond just containerizing it. But containerizing it is definitely a part of it as well. So you need to understand, like, when I containerize this, how is communication going to work with my application?
Right.
Both that northwest and that east-west traffic, right? And you have that east-west traffic within the Kubernetes cluster itself. Like, is container A or really pod A going to talk to pod B? Or container A going to talk to container B? And how's it going to do that? Do I need to secure that traffic? What does that look like? And then going into your cluster and accessing those containers as well, right? So there we get into things like ingress controllers, or are you going to use a load balancer? How's the traffic going to get in? Does my container need to talk to a database? Is that database also running as a container, which is not something you typically see? Or is my database running as PaaS, or is it running on a VM that's running on cloud, right? How am I going to facilitate that communication? So all of those pieces go into containerizing your application. But there's a tool from Microsoft called Draft, and it's actually been around for a little while. It's kind of gone through some iterations. It's an open source tool, and you can use Draft to help containerize your applications. And so if you're a developer, right, and you have your application in a Git repository, you could take this tool Draft and you can actually point it at your application's repository and run through the tool. Now, the tool is a command line based tool, but there's also an extension in Visual Studio Code now, so VS Code, where you can point the tool at your code, and then the tool prompts you and asks you what language is your application written in, right? So if you have some JavaScript based components or application, if it's PHP, if it's Python based, if it's something else like Go, you select that, and then what it does is it actually containerizes your application for you. And what that means is it's creating the Docker file for you. And so now you have that Docker file. That's one starting point. You have to kind of start there, right? Your application is containerized, and it generated this container for you. The next step, right, if we want to run it on AKS or we want to run it on Kubernetes, is we're going to need to generate either a Kubernetes manifest file. Maybe you're going to use a Helm chart, or maybe you might use like Kustomize, right? You might run it in one of those three kind of formats and use that to deploy to your Kubernetes cluster or your AKS. And so this tool Draft can do that for you as well. So that would be the next step. You would point it at your application that's containerized, and then you would, tell the tool Draft, hey, I want to create a Helm chart or a Kubernetes manifest file. And so it will actually create that for you as well. And what it's doing, let's say if we're creating a Kubernetes manifest file, it's going to create the deployment for you. And it's also going to create the service. So if you're going to run it as a load balancer, it will create that as well, so that when you deploy it to your Kubernetes cluster, it's going to create that component as well as the pods in the Kubernetes cluster to run your application. And then from there, right? So that's one step. You create that Kubernetes manifest file. And the next step is like, all right, we need to push this container image up to a container registry. And we need to actually deploy this container to our Kubernetes cluster. And so just because you have a Docker file and you have a Kubernetes manifest file or even a Helm chart doesn't mean it's deployed to your Kubernetes cluster. You need something to help you do that as well. So Azure Draft can help with that as well. And what it does is it will actually create a deployment for you to AKS.
So there's
And
really nothing that me as an engineer stops me to leverage this product to containerize my Git ready applications towards Kubernetes or towards any container service within Azure, right? So it sounds so simple.
it's the idea behind it is like, let's simplify this, right? Let's
Mhm.
simplify this process of containerizing your application and deploying your application to Kubernetes. So once you have the Kubernetes manifest file, you can use Azure Draft to generate the actual deployment. And what it's doing there is it's creating a GitHub action workflow for you.
Wow.
And within that GitHub action workflow, it is doing the build. So it's taking your containerized application, it'll push it up to an Azure container registry, and then it will actually deploy, pulling from that Azure container registry, deploying to your Kubernetes cluster, well, AKS. And so it creates that GitHub action workflow for you. And then that can actually run from your GitHub and deploy right to your AKS cluster. There is two other things I did not mention. So with Azure Draft, it also can create an OIDC connection between your resource group, right, in Azure. So that's where hopefully your Azure Container Registry is. It should be in there. And then your AKS cluster. So it creates the connection between that and your GitHub repository. That way it's taking care of that authentication. And so when you go to deploy from that GitHub action workflow, it has the proper permissions, right, to deploy from your Git repository to your AKS cluster, as well as talk to your Azure Container Registry. So it's helping to facilitate all of that, and it makes it way easier. The other thing I forgot to mention, is that when you're architecting, or after you're done architecting your AKS cluster, you can use something called the AKS Construction Helper. And the AKS Construction Helper is another tool from Microsoft. It's free. And you go in there, it's a wizard-driven tool, or, there's a form in the browser, and you specify what you want in your AKS cluster, right? So you specify like how many nodes, what ingress controller you want, what version of AKS or Kubernetes do you want to run, like all of those kind of things. Do you want it RBAC enabled with Azure Active Directory? After you specify everything you want with the AKS Construction Helper, it will generate code to deploy your AKS clusters for you. And so it'll give you Terraform, Azure command line interface code, ARM template code, or even Bicep code. And you can take that and go deploy your AKS clusters. And so you can start to use these like frameworks from Microsoft, right? The AKS landing zone, security baseline, and the AKS accelerator, which that AKS construction helper is a part of that. You can start to use all of these things, and including Draft, to make your AKS story easier and a smoother process.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. And I know that like GitHub is probably one of the more known companies that has been acquired by Microsoft, but Draft was actually also a product that has been acquired through an acquisition. But following it in the last few months, because you mentioned it earlier to me. So I did my homework. I did some research on it,
Nice.
and I see that the product teams are even building support for Azure CLI and all that kind of sweetness that we know of the bigger Azure picture, right? So it follows the corporate strategy of Microsoft, or actually the Azure part of the strategy of Microsoft. So it fits perfectly within that biosystem. And
Yeah.
there are some things you mentioned that I want to circle back to, because there are a lot of terms that you use that I would like to deep dive in more. So I'll get back on that stateless and stateful part
All
later.
right.
But one among the many reasons for organizations to build containers and to work with Kubernetes is storing application and declarative infrastructure code within a Git repository, right? So
Yeah.
better known as DevOps and GitOps practices. But
Oh, GitOps. Yeah.
yeah, but
I didn't even mention that, but yeah,
no,
yeah.
but you did mention the pull method, and
Yeah.
we have also something which is called the push method. But before we dive into that, what is the difference between a push and a pull method?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so what I described, right, with Azure Draft is using the push method. And so using that GitHub Actions workflow basically to push your application, your containerized application from ACR, Azure Container Registry, to AKS.
Mhm.
And so in your CI, which is your continuous integration, right? That's where your build is happening. That's where the application is built and pushed up to like ACR. And then in your CD, that's where it's deployed to your AKS cluster, right? And so in that CD, you can go with push or pull. If we're pushing, we're using a tool to literally push our application to AKS,
So
right?
we would have some kind of trigger that would trigger the push towards your cluster.
Exactly. And that trigger, I'm glad you said that. That trigger is specified in that GitHub Actions workflow. And so for anyone that's worked with GitHub Actions workflow or GitHub Actions, there's a bunch of different triggers that you can set. So you can actually set a trigger in there to kick off the process or kick off the workflow if new code is committed to that repository, right? Then it will fire and it will do everything. It will start to build again, push up to the container registry,
Mhm.
and it will push to your AKA to your AKS cluster. Now with a pull method, right? There's something literally pulling the deployment down to your AKS cluster. And so now we're talking about, I mean, there's many ways to do pull, but now we're going to get into GitOps a little bit. And so with GitOps, it's a pattern, right? It's not a technology, and I hope we're kind of past that misconception. But GitOps is a pattern for deploying applications and handling desired state of your applications or your cluster, like your infrastructure. And so with GitOps, we have something called the GitOps operators. And the GitOps operators are basically just software, and they're software that runs on Kubernetes clusters. So you can think of them as agents,
Mhm.
and they're always looking at your Git repository for changes.
So
And
you're referring to software like Argo CD, Flux, those kind of tools, right?
exactly, exactly. And so you'll be running your GitOps operator, maybe Flux, maybe Argo CD on your AKS cluster, and you point that at a Git repository. And so what happens is when, let's say, with Argo CD, it sees a change in your Kubernetes manifest file. It says, hey, there's a change. and it triggers and it starts it makes those changes happen in your AKS cluster, right? And so now that's a pull method because you have this agent or AKA software running on your Kubernetes cluster. It's looking for changes. And when those changes happen, it's pulling that onto your Kubernetes cluster. The other thing that GitOps can do is if it sees changes on your Kubernetes cluster that doesn't match what you have specified in your Git repository, it will bring it back to the state that it was in, right? And
Ah.
so that's where it helps with your desired state.
So I was actually thinking, about why would I use a pull method when I'm actually thinking in workload and performance, right? Because I add a little workload into my cluster just to be checking to track those changes within my Git repository. But in the push method, I can trigger it whenever there is a change in my Git repository. But you answered the question already because it's continuously watching if it matches your desired state. Awesome, awesome.
Exactly. The other thing that GitOps does is it helps so you can shift security, right? And so with GitOps, the idea is that you don't have to give your developers direct access to your Kubernetes cluster. In fact, there's a benefit to your developers in that they don't have to learn kube control commands.
Yeah.
They don't have to learn how that whole mechanism works, right? Or
Mhm.
of doing kube control apply or working with Helm charts or any of that. All they have to worry about is like, I have my code, my application that I'm developing, and I commit it to this repository. And then the idea behind GitOps is like, okay, we have new code that's committed to this repository. My GitOps operator is just going to take care of deploying it and deploying it in the right way, in the secure way. So your GitOps operator sits on the Kubernetes cluster, and your Kubernetes admin is the one that gave it permission, right, on your Kubernetes cluster to deploy stuff to your Kubernetes cluster. And so you kind of keep that security over there on the Kubernetes cluster. And with your Kubernetes admin and whoever that team might be that actually administers your Kubernetes cluster, but you don't have to have these other folks on other teams, having access to your Kubernetes cluster, because with a push method, right? Whoever's building that CI/CD pipeline has to have access to your Kubernetes cluster in order to deploy it to your Kubernetes cluster. So they have to configure something in that CI/CD pipeline to be able to do that, right? The other thing is with GitOps, you're supposed to do everything through Git, right?
Mhm.
And so Git becomes the source of truth. And so organically, you have an audit log because you don't give folks on the team or other teams access to the Kubernetes cluster. So if they need to make a change, they're doing it through Git, right? So they're either making a change to the application or they're making a change to the infrastructure as code, and they're doing that all through Git. So what happens is you organically have a change log there. And if you need to do an audit of what happened to our cluster, what changes were made, you can go and look in the Git history, right? Whereas with the push method, and both methods are good, right? Both methods serve a purpose, and organizations can use whatever method they want.
Mhm.
But what I've seen out there in the real world is that you know
You
folks
have
will
those
have
manual activities in the portal experience. We all know them, right?
exactly. So something happens, or maybe your CI/CD pipeline's not quite working the way it should. And so folks need to do something very fast. Either they're troubleshooting something, or they're under tight deadlines and they just need to get something deployed.
Mm.
So what happens? They go and they start running kube control commands. They connect to the Kubernetes cluster. They're making changes. They're doing stuff. And so that stuff is happening on that Kubernetes cluster. And so you lose track of what's been done, right? And so that can make things challenging. The other thing I saw a lot in the real world is DevOps people and organizations and teams were using Terraform, and Terraform's awesome, right? Works really well. They're using Terraform to build out their infrastructure as code for, let's say, their Azure infrastructure and their AKS infrastructure.
Mhm.
They're using that to deploy their stuff. Well, it works really, really well for that. And you can use it to update your stuff as well, but it's I saw a lot of teams and organizations using it to deploy, but when they needed to do stuff later on, they'd just jump on a Kubernetes cluster and they'd start making changes there or deploying stuff there, or right. So
Mm.
now you have two ways of doing things. And with GitOps, the idea is like Git becomes that source of truth. And so you can use it with Terraform as well, by the way. But Git becomes that source of truth. So you start to do everything through Git and let the GitOps operator deploy, whether it's changes to your infrastructure or it's your application,
And I'm
right?
already thinking about the business value in this, because I serve some customers in the finance and banking sector in the Netherlands, and we all have, like, you have the United States Bank, and the we have the World Bank, we have the European Bank, and the Nederlandse Bank, the Dutch bank, and they require to have a very specific audit, control and logging history, right?
Mm.
And so it's quite interesting to envision this GitOps practice or method towards those compliancy and regulatory requirements, because for a long time a lot of companies thought they should keep practicing things as they were and as they were doing, following very strict processes and writing documentation. And, well, I'm not saying you shouldn't document your technical changes, but this is like the best of two worlds, right? So you have a modern approach. You can collaborate between dev and ops, because let's be honest, in the last few years, we all shouted DevOps methods and DevOps principles, but we were actually very much failing in practicing real DevOps. So
Right.
this is like the best of two worlds. If you can really practice this as you just explained, and keeping it with the theory and bring it to practice, it's like the golden formula.
Yeah, spot on. And just like with DevOps, GitOps also will take a cultural shift, right?
Mm.
It is a pattern, and so you have to have your teams willing to adopt the pattern, and there are tools with GitOps to help you do that. But again, it's a cultural shift. So if your team is not ready to make that cultural shift, then it's still going to be limited in the results that you're going to get out of it. Now, I want to call out that, if you want to do GitOps and you want to use like Azure Draft, you certainly can. If you want to do GitOps and you want to use GitHub Actions, you could certainly do that too. And I just shared a link with you. I might have shared it with you before. There's an article that I worked on last year, and it's actually a part of the Azure Architecture Center. So you can find it out there. And it's titled Build and Deploy Apps on AKS Using DevOps and GitOps. And what it does is this article really breaks down the pull and the push method. And it gives an example with diagrams that you can download and modify, right, in Visio. It gives you diagrams and examples of how to do both. And so if you're doing GitOps and you want to use GitHub Actions, and you could bring Azure Draft into this as well, the architecture is there to do that. And in the example in the article, we're using Argo CD, but you could certainly use Flux, or you could even use another GitOps operator if you wanted to. But what we're doing there is we have our Kubernetes manifest file, and in our GitHub Actions workflow, we're running that. So we're doing the build, we're pushing it up to ACR. And then our GitHub Actions workflow is actually modifying our Kubernetes manifest deployment file. And it's writing the proper Azure Container Registry URL, and or not URL, but FQDN and the image name, right? So it has all of that in there. And so you take Argo CD or Flux and you point it at that specific folder. So we're using one repository in this example, but you point it at that folder. And so when it sees changes, it will go ahead and deploy to your Kubernetes cluster. So you can use Azure Draft, right? You can containerize your application. You could point it up to ACR. You can have your Kubernetes manifest deployment file built by Azure Draft. You have that in your repository, and you can use this method in this architecture to do either that pull or push method. And so I just wanted to make it clear that even if you're doing GitOps, you can start to put the Lego pieces together and kind of use what you want to use.
Yeah, awesome. I'm actually seeing the red line of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, the CAF, in your explanation, because we mentioned the accelerator, the landing zones. So you have that foundation, that fundamental level of well, let's say platform or infrastructure that you need, and all the way up to govern and manage with GitOps practices or patterns, as you say.
Yes.
So and all those sweet spots between, and all is being supported by all kind of different tools and best practices from the Microsoft Learn and the Microsoft Architecture Center, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I will make
Definitely.
sure that the link that you shared is being shown on screen for our YouTube viewers right now, and I will add it in the description for our Spotify and Google Podcast listeners. Yeah, surely you should check this out. I would like to shift a little bit to another subject that is close to your heart. And you actually wrote a book about this as well. And I have to admit, this is one that I have read.
Nice. Thank
It's
you.
the yeah. So all of your books are on Amazon, and this one is close to my heart because I've read somewhere that almost 75% of the world's infrastructure is still within private cloud. So that means that we are, well, I think it's super relevant today that we talk about hybrid cloud strategies, right? And you have a book called Azure Arc Enabled Kubernetes and Service. And I'm a big fan of Azure Arc. Unfortunately, in my day-to-day practice, I don't think we use it enough. But how does Azure Arc fit into the explanation of GitOps practices and leveraging those hybrid cloud strategies in a world of containerization?
Yeah, great question and great points too. And before we go into that, I want to give a shout out to my co-author on the book, John Joyner. He's still a Microsoft MVP, and he co-authored the book for me, and he does a ton of stuff with Azure Arc. So yeah, Azure Arc definitely fits into the hybrid cloud, multi-cloud strategy out there and can help you manage and power that story, right? And you brought up a really good point that a lot of organizations still have some on-premises. A lot of organizations, I would argue most from what I've seen in the field, have multiple clouds. And so, you know, you're going to see AWS, you're going to see GCP, and you're going to definitely see Azure in organizations out there. And so with this multi-cloud, like, how do you manage all of that, right? Is the answer Terraform? Terraform can help, but it's not the end all be all to managing your multi-cloud.
Mm-hmm.
You know, each one of the clouds are slightly different in their API layer, right? And so if you're writing code to manage these clouds, things are going to be slightly different. If you're using the portal for Azure, if you're using the console for GCP or AWS, it's going to be a slightly different experience as well, right? A lot of the services are the same, just different names. Once you learn one cloud, it's easier to kind of pick up on other clouds and get in there and start doing things, but there's going to be differences. And so, you know, with Azure Arc, you can utilize the management capabilities in Azure, right? And you can use the stuff you've learned in Azure, like resource groups or resource graphs, and extend that to other clouds. And you can extend that to your on-premises. And so if you're used to managing things and governing things using resource groups, you can onboard your on-premises infrastructure like virtual machines or Kubernetes clusters, or even like SQL servers into Azure Arc, and you can put them into resource groups and you can manage them that way. If you're used to using tagging in Azure, right? Maybe you have that tied to some cost management stuff that you're doing.
Yep.
You can onboard resources into Azure Arc, and they'll show up in resource groups, and you can start to use tagging, right, on those on-premises servers that you might still have, right? And if you're doing some sort of cost management, now you can apply that towards your on-premises or even other clouds. And if we have virtual machines running, let's say in AWS, if we're running some EC2 instances, right? You can actually use Azure Arc, onboard those into Azure Arc, and you can use the update management in Azure to help with your patching, right? You can use Azure Monitor to help monitor those machines. And the same applies for your Kubernetes clusters, right? You can use Azure Arc Enable Kubernetes and extend that to Kubernetes clusters, regardless if you rolled your own or if you're using EKS or maybe you're using GKE. You can onboard those into Azure Arc Enable Kubernetes, and they show up as Kubernetes clusters. You could see that they're running on these other clouds, and you can start to apply things like Azure policy against those Kubernetes clusters. And so you can start to enforce like compliance, governance, things like that. Also at Microsoft, we have Flux integrated into Azure Arc Enable Kubernetes. And so that lights up GitOps. And so if you onboard clusters into Azure Arc Enable Kubernetes, you can apply GitOps configurations down to your Kubernetes clusters, regardless of where they are, regardless if they're, you deployed your own on a VM or you deployed it using another managed service. You can pull that all into one interface. And you can also start to use things like Azure Monitor Container Insights, which is our monitoring capabilities for Kubernetes. You can use that on external Kubernetes clusters. And so you can start to see that you can use Azure Arc as your central point of management, right?
It's like one cloud to rule them all. So I'm thinking about Lord of the Rings, right? One ring to rule them all. Just creating that single point of management and governance for your multi-cloud or hybrid cloud strategy and landscape. Yeah, I'm a really big fan about Azure Arc. And for the people that don't quite understand what Azure Arc really is, under the hood, they're agents.
Yes. Yeah, really good point. Really good point. And for anyone that wants to get started with Azure Arc, right, I highly recommend going out there and picking up the Azure Arc Jumpstart Kit.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And shout out to Lior Comrat. He runs that and heads up that group, and they're doing really great work with the Jumpstart Kit. But what the Jumpstart is it's a series of articles as well as code to help you get started with Azure Arc. Azure Arc Data, Azure Arc Enable Kubernetes, Azure Arc Servers, really anything under that Azure Arc umbrella. And they've also developed some tools now where you can actually go grab some code and deploy a full Azure Arc instance with a bunch of infrastructure on Azure to really test it out, right? And it's like one-click deploy. I mean, they're doing some really amazing stuff there with that Jumpstart Kit.
Yeah, I actually a month ago tried the full Arc jump box, which is right over there within the repository. and I must say it works flawlessly. So you just download the code, put it in your Git repo. You have some tweaking to do for your pipelines, but it works absolutely great.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, so if you want to get started with Azure Arc and you just want to experiment and try it out, go check that out.
Yeah, so it's really awesome because they actually deploy Azure Virtual Machines, which has Hyper-V installed within them just to represent an on-premise environment. They did a lot of cool things in there.
Yeah, definitely. So
I have one burning question, and unfortunately, we're already way ahead of time. But I have one burning question that I really need to ask you, and that is: do you think that we will come into the situation in the upcoming years that traditional data centers or private clouds will no longer exist?
I find that hard to. I don't think so. And I think if we do, I think we're many years out from that.
Mm,
And I'm speaking from experience of just being in the cloud. I mean, I was working with Fortune 500 organizations. I've also worked in that mid market too. But with the Fortune 500 organizations, they have these massive infrastructures, right? And they've invested millions and millions and millions into data centers.
true.
A lot of these organizations are global, which means they're in countries where the data needs to stay there or things need to stay local from a latency perspective. And so I think for the foreseeable future, even if an organization says, hey, we're a cloud first organization, they're going to have some footprint in on premises.
Mm.
It might be small, it might be somewhat big, but there's going to be some sort of footprint on premises. Also, keep in mind that the multi-cloud, right? And so a lot of organizations are adopting multi-cloud and they want the flexibility to move their workloads around as needed. So let's say one of the cloud providers increases their prices dramatically, right?
True.
CIOs want the flexibility, like, this is costing way too much. What options do we have? Can we move these workloads back on premises to cut costs? Can we move them to another cloud that might have a lower cost? Is there better services on another cloud? Can we do this better on premises? Just this piece of the application or just these workloads, can we do it better than maybe a cloud provider? Chances of that, I don't know. The cloud providers do a really excellent job of with the infrastructure and the clouds that we have. But so I think the on premises is here to
Here to
stay.
stay. Yeah, here to stay for
Here to
quite
stay.
some time. Yeah. Well,
I think organizations that adopt that cloud first strategy or are really diving into the cloud migration, yeah, they're going to move most of their workloads up to the cloud, but there's always those one-off things, those one-off workloads or applications like, I got to run that on premises.
yeah, so we all have legacy and we all have to comply with regulatory and well, that kind of stuff. So I figure you are right. And that's because that's why Azure Arc is such an amazing product and a service that Microsoft helps you to overcome these well these truths about on-premise environments, right? And obviously about lowering your total cost of ownership when embracing a multi-cloud strategy.
Yeah, definitely.
Like I said, unfortunately, we're out of time already. I would like to thank you very much for being here, and it was a pleasure to have you on Azure Talks. And maybe you can hang with me again sometime within this because we just started 2023, right? So we have a full year ahead of us. So I would very much would love to invite you again later this year. In the meantime, where can people find you online, Steve?
Yeah, so people can find me at Bukatech. And so that's my Twitter handle. You can also find me on Mastodon on at Bukatech. You can find me on my blog at bukatech.com. And so really just search for Bukatech and you'll find me, right?
Awesome, awesome. And is there any closing words or anything that you would like to share with our listeners before we wrap it up?
Well, I want to say, thank you to having me on the podcast, and I'd definitely love to come on later in the future. I'm sure there's going to be more exciting things to talk about. And for all the listeners, like if you haven't tried AKS, if you haven't tried, Azure or Azure Arc, um, jump out there and try them out. It's definitely something to start looking at. So, and if there's any questions or anything like that, just follow me on Twitter or Mastodon, and let's connect.
Awesome, awesome. And thank you again, Steve. And to all the listeners, thank you for listening or watching. Once again, the best wishes for the new year. Azure Talks will be here. Will be here in 2023 as well. Hopefully, you will be joining us again. And well, see you out there. Bye.